And yet others would say that really what Xi Jinping is doing is offering support to other authoritarian leaders. They might not mind, though.
Days after Trump directed two U.S. nuclear submarines to reposition in response to online threats made by Dmitry Medvedev.
The first reports came in at dawn, a flurry of alerts lighting up military dashboards and newswires almost simultaneously. 12 Russian cruise missiles had been fired, their trajectory unmistakable, their target chillingly clear, a United States forward base positioned in a critical region. Within minutes, the world was on edge, bracing for the fallout of what could spiral into open war between two nuclear powers. For years, tensions had simmered between Washington and Moscow.
One is through diplomacy and dialogue. The other is through deterrence and massive consequences for Russia.
Proxy wars, sanctions, cyber operations, and political maneuvering had defined the relationship. But never had Russia gone so far as to directly target a U.S. military installation. This was not saber-rattling or a warning shot. It was a direct challenge to American power, and the Pentagon knew it. The missiles streaked across the sky with deadly precision, Russian engineering put to its ultimate test. Analysts watching satellite feeds couldn't believe what they were seeing. A full-scale strike package, not a random launch. Russian state media initially boasted that the attack would cripple U.S. operations in the region, sending a message that Moscow was ready to escalate far beyond rhetoric. But reality played out very differently. As the missiles closed in, U.S. defense systems roared to life. The base was equipped with layered defenses, Patriot batteries, THAAD interceptors, and ship-based Aegis systems positioned nearby. Radar locks were instantaneous. Interceptors fired in salvos, and within seconds the night sky lit up with explosions. 10 of the 12 missiles were destroyed mid-air, leaving fiery streaks as debris rained harmlessly into the desert sands below. 2 managed to break through. 1 slammed into a vehicle depot, destroying armored trucks but causing no casualties. The other hit a storage facility, igniting fuel tanks but sparing the barracks. The damage was real, but far from crippling. The U.S. response was immediate, decisive, and brutal. Within hours, bombers were airborne, cruise missiles were armed, and drones took off from hidden runways.
Days after Trump directed two U.S. nuclear submarines to reposition in response to online threats made by Dmitry Medvedev.
The Pentagon was determined to make Russia feel the weight of its gamble. A clear message had to be sent. You do not fire on American forces and walk away unscathed. The chosen targets were symbolic as well as strategic. Intelligence pointed to the Russian missile batteries that had launched the strike. Satellite imagery locked their locations. American bombers flew low and fast, evading radar before unleashing precision-guided munitions. Explosions tore through Russian launch sites, flattening equipment and silencing crews. Drones followed, striking command centers with surgical accuracy. Within 24 hours, nearly the entire Russian unit responsible for the attack had been annihilated. But the retaliation did not stop there. Cyber units went to work, targeting Russian communications infrastructure. Television signals flickered, internet services slowed, and command chains suffered unexplained breakdowns. While Moscow scrambled to maintain control, Washington's cyber offensive ensured confusion spread through Russian ranks. At the same time, U.S. naval forces in international waters conducted live-fire exercises pointedly close to Russian fleets, a thinly veiled threat of escalation.
Russia, where Russian President Vladimir Putin has sent out a direct nuclear warning to U.S. President Donald Trump.
The shock in Russia was palpable. State media, which had triumphantly declared victory hours earlier, was forced to pivot to damage control. Officials downplayed the losses, insisting that the American response was limited and ineffective. Yet leaked videos showed burning Russian vehicles, destroyed radar systems, and smoldering bases. Russian citizens, already weary of sanctions and economic strain, began questioning the wisdom of provoking Washington so directly. In Washington, leaders walked a tightrope. The president addressed the nation, his tone resolute but measured. "Let it be clear," he declared, "the United States will defend its people and its forces wherever they stand. We do not seek war, but we will never allow aggression against us to go unanswered. Behind closed doors, however, advisors debated how far to push. Some advocated for restraint, fearing full-scale war. Others insisted that Russia must be crushed with overwhelming force to deter future attacks. Allies quickly rallied to America's side. NATO issued a statement condemning the Russian strike as reckless and destabilizing. European leaders, often divided on how to handle Moscow, stood united for once, warning that Article 5, the alliance's mutual defense clause, was not far from being tested. In Asia, partners like Japan and South Korea expressed solidarity, aware that their own security was tied to the credibility of U.S. deterrence. Meanwhile, China watched carefully. Beijing issued vague statements calling for calm, but behind the scenes, Chinese officials studied the confrontation with great interest. To them, the speed and precision of the American retaliation was a reminder of U.S. military dominance, even as Washington was stretched thin globally. The lesson was clear. Provoking the United States carried consequences that few could endure.
And yet others would say that really what Xi Jinping is doing is offering support to other authoritarian leaders. They might not mind, though.
On the ground, the soldiers at the targeted base became reluctant heroes. Images of them standing amidst the wreckage, brushing off debris, tending to fires, and raising the stars and stripes once more flooded global news. Their resilience became a rallying cry, a symbol that America had absorbed the blow and come back stronger. Families back home watched with pride and relief, grateful that casualties were minimal despite the ferocity of the attack. Russian military planners had expected a different outcome. Their strike was meant to test U.S. defenses to prove that American bases abroad were vulnerable. Instead, they had exposed their own weakness. The near-total interception of their missiles was a propaganda disaster, while the U.S. counterattack showcased capabilities that Russia struggled to match.
They perform this choreograph in the sky. They get close enough to take photographs of each other, and that proves the fact that we're onto them, and if this was a war, you'd have been dead 20 minutes ago.
Intelligence reports suggested morale in Russian units plummeted in the aftermath, with soldiers fearing further retaliation. Economically, the fallout was immediate. Global oil prices spiked as markets feared wider conflict. The ruble plunged while the U.S. dollar and defense stocks surged. Sanctions discussions intensified in Western capitals with calls for punishing Russia further. Ordinary Russians bore the brunt as inflation soared and supplies tightened, fueling discontent at home. Diplomatic backchannels buzzed with urgency. Envoys scrambled to prevent escalation. Switzerland and Turkey offered to mediate while the United Nations convened an emergency session. At the Security Council, Russia faced condemnation from most members, with its only allies offering muted defenses. The U.S. ambassador thundered, "When you target our soldiers, you cross a line that no nation should cross." This council must not allow such aggression to go unanswered. Moscow's official response was defiance. Leaders insisted the strike was a necessary defensive action, claiming, without evidence, that U.S. forces had provoked them. But privately, Russian officials were shaken. The destruction of their missile units, the cyber disruptions, and the international backlash had left them isolated. What was meant to be a show of strength had instead become a costly humiliation.
And according to the Russian government, America plans to station intermediate-range missile systems in both Europe and Asia.
As days turned into weeks, the world held its breath. Would Russia strike again, doubling down? Or would the brutal U.S. response serve as a deterrent? Analysts debated endlessly. Some argued that Moscow could not afford further escalation. Others warned that a cornered Kremlin might lash out unpredictably. For Washington, the challenge was maintaining deterrence without plunging into all-out war.
To Russian military aggression. And now, with Moscow threatening once more, it's never been more vital to the security of this region.
Within the United States, political divisions briefly gave way to unity. Even critics of the administration rallied around the flag, insisting that defending American troops was non-negotiable. Congressional leaders approved emergency funding for defense readiness, while governors offered support to military families. The sense of national resolve was unmistakable. The soldiers on the front lines felt it too. Reinforcements poured into the base, bringing advanced anti-missile systems, drones, and fighter jets. Morale soared as troops realized they were not only protected, but backed by overwhelming firepower. Training drills intensified, with soldiers preparing for the possibility of another strike. Every day they stood ready, a living symbol of deterrence. Around the world, commentators drew comparisons to pivotal Cold War moments. Some called it the most dangerous confrontation since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Others argued that it marked a turning point, a moment when Russia's aggressive posture finally met a wall of resistance. Either way, history had been written in fire and steel. Behind the headlines, personal stories emerged. A young American pilot who intercepted one of the incoming missiles became a household name. His calm radio calls replayed on television. A group of medics who saved lives in the aftermath of the depot strike were honored for bravery. Families reunited with their loved ones, holding them tightly after days of uncertainty. The human dimension gave the crisis a face, reminding the world that beyond geopolitics, real lives hung in the balance. For Russia, the lesson was harsh. Their strike had failed to achieve its goals, and the cost had been staggering.
Tonight, after 2 high-stakes calls in the span of a month, Russian and American diplomats kicking off a week of intense negotiations.
For the United States, the crisis reinforced an old truth. Deterrence works only when backed by action. By responding swiftly and brutally, Washington had preserved its credibility. Yet both sides knew the confrontation was not over. The scars of the attack would linger, shaping strategy and mistrust for years to come.
The move to what he described as NATO's anti-Russia stance and warned of additional actions to come.
In the end, what shocked Russia most was not just the ferocity of the U.S. retaliation, but the speed of it. Within a single day, Moscow's bold strike had turned into a humiliating setback. The Kremlin had expected fear, hesitation, and chaos. Instead, it encountered precision, unity, and overwhelming force. The image of those intercepted missiles exploding mid-air, followed by the roar of American bombers over Russian positions, became etched into global memory. It was a brutal reminder that wars are not won by bravado or propaganda, but by readiness, resilience, and the will to strike back.
There will be massive consequences for Russia if it renews its aggression, economic, financial, and other consequences.
And as the dust settled, one thing was clear. The world had stepped to the brink, peered over the edge, and been pulled back only by the sheer dominance of America's response. Russia's gamble had backfired spectacularly. The United States had proven once again that its reach was global, its resolve unshakable, and its enemies would pay dearly for underestimating it.